Peter. Okay, Dr. Desai, we are ready to go.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you for making it in, and for those of you who view this later or simultaneously now. I'm Virend Desai. I'm a neurodevelopmental pediatrician and one of the principal investigators on this study that's looking at music and neurodevelopment. And this is part of a much larger study that our group, the Advanced Baby Imaging Lab at Brown University, is involved in. It's a study of the environmental influences on child health outcomes. Music is one of those influences that we're studying, but we're studying a lot of other influences: nutrition, diet, exercise, lifestyle, sleep, genetics, a whole bunch of different things that we'll go into on neurodevelopment, all the way from the prenatal stages, at about 22 weeks of gestation, all the way through 12 years of age. So this study is funded by the National Institutes of Health, and we are one of about 32 cohorts around the country, about 82 sites around the country, that's studying various aspects that go into influencing early brain development. The hope is to target about 50,000 children through this initial phase of study, and then eventually go into hundreds of thousands of kids and hopefully millions, and studying their development through the lifespan of childhood and then into adulthood as well. So as I talk a little bit about the background of this study, like I said, it's the NIH-sponsored ECHO piece, and what we decided on was looking at specific areas that seem to influence neurodevelopment. One being music. And we know a lot about music influencing behavior, influencing social emotional outcomes in children, it being sort of structured in a therapeutic manner to help children with disabilities, children with behavioral disabilities and disorders. And we wanted to kind of start looking at some of those mechanisms by which that seems to happen, both from a functional aspect in terms of how the brain is sort of responding and how the child is responding to some of these changes, but also to see if there are any changes that are actually happening structurally within the brain. And this would be over the course of time. So if you can go to the next slide. So broadly speaking, we're looking at studying the effect of music on brain development. But when we sort of hone that down a little bit, we're looking at specific domains of interest within that. One of them being social emotional development. We're looking at cognition from an overall sort of neurocognitive standpoint, looking at verbal versus nonverbal skills, and the acquisition of those skills and the abilities that a child might demonstrate. Speech and communication and the quality of that, but also quantifying that as much as possible. Movement for those children who might be a little older and get into a little more of the sort of rhythm of music, maybe even get into an instrument and play one. Or learn to play one. And then we're looking at the effect that some of this exposure has on early learning. We're looking at pre-academics for obviously the younger kids, and then early academics for some of the older children. Within that, we're trying to focus a little bit on certain areas of pre-academics and academics. Phonemics is one of them, sort of the letter sound recognition and the blending of those sounds appropriately to form words. Spells, math, and pattern recognition. Now, we sort of selected these three primarily because music tends to light up certain parts of the brain depending on how it's recognized. So there are certain aspects of music that might be recognized by one part of the brain, but as it starts getting into, the person starts attributing meaning to it during its interpretation, whether it's a tune, whether they're linking it to words because it's the tune that is part of the song. The interpretation of that switches over to towards the side where language interpretation occurs. So that tends to be in the more dominant hemisphere. And about 95% of individuals that would be the left side. So a lot of times what starts off as random sounds, as the tune has more meaning, it tends to shift over to the left side of the brain or the other side of the brain. While it still continues to require interpretation on one side, it also starts evening out on the other side, some activity there. And similarly, when you're looking at phonemics and you're looking at the sounds that letters produce or the sounds that words have, when a child first hears those words, they hear them as just sounds. But as soon as they have meaning through linguistics and language, the sound interpretation starts switching over to the other side of the brain, and they use that into that side of the brain to process that, to have a little more. So that's why we sort of think some of it. So our study right now is based on a lot of early work that we've done on typically developing children from birth to 5 years. There wasn't much information on mapping the developmental trajectory of the structure of the brain that a child might have as he or she develops from birth to 5 years of age. And that was primarily because the best way to study it would have been to actually look at the brain histologically. But there weren't as many brains, to section and to sort of examine. And there weren't imaging techniques that were developed that could be replicated and used in babies and young children in order to get serial measurements of their brain as they continue to early life. The lab has perfected the art of imaging these children through MRI techniques multiple times, but doing it without sedation. So these children are asleep or they're taking naps, and we have quietened down the scanner, the MRI scanner, so that it doesn't wake the baby up, because an MRI scanner can be pretty noisy. And we've been able to sort of get multiple scans on these babies, overlay them according to age, and then create this composite picture all the way from 3 months to 60 months, or 5 years of age, in terms of mapping out the developmental structure of the brain. So what you're seeing here, these lit up portions are the white matter connections of the brain. So that's where the cells connect all the way down through the spinal cord. It's that myelin that's sort of surrounding the almost like the electrical conducting system of the brain, and that's what you're seeing develop from a very faint structure early on, all the way to a much more robust, identifiable kind of pattern in a child about 60 months of age, and then of course beyond. And this tends to happen based on how a child uses their brain. So the more muscles they use, the more parts of the brain they're using, the more conduction there is of signals from the brain down to the muscles, and that's where the white matter starts developing a little better. The circuits where they don't use them as much, those tend to underdevelop, or they tend to sort of die away, and the rest of the circuits take over and they develop better. So based on this, while we were looking at the structural development of the brain, we were also collecting information on various aspects of the environment that were influencing this, to kind of get a sense of whether there were any patterns that were developing in terms of causality. We were collecting information on nutrition, on child rearing practices, on sleep, genetics, and various other markers. And we found that there were certain patterns. So there were slight differences between children who were nursed versus children who had received formula during certain phases of their early childhood. Certain patterns in children who had certain family histories versus others. And so we decided to apply for this other grant to kind of expand the study a little more and look at whether these factors were clearly causing a difference, or whether they were just associated very loosely in relation to many other factors that we were involved. So this video, and you're going to see this part change in color all the way from blue, it starts going up to red. But it kind of maps out from 3 months of age, that's 90 days, all the way up to 5 years of age. It maps out the speed at which the development occurs, or that trajectory that the development takes in white matter. Now, this is the front part of the head. This is the rear, so it's just this image that's kind of overlaid here. But it's a composite of of images of different kids, but at different stages. And you can sort of see that development. So display that. And you can see that these regions are beginning to get more sort of, as we say, lit up. But that's because there's a much stronger, higher myelin content as you go up to 5 years of age. It starts off in regions that are pretty commonly lit up just because the babies have that motor control. Not that they don't have motor control, but they've got motor movement. And that tends to be in this region here, carrying those impulses down from the motor cortex down to the muscles and the limbs. But it's also these regions that tend to develop a little earlier, and these would be to the visual cortex. So a lot of it, they're relying a lot on the visual input, and then you see these regions here that are also developing almost simultaneously to the regions of the visual, and that's because of the auditory signal. Obviously, as they process things, as they're able to move a little more, do a little more, plan a little more, you see these regions developing a little bit. So what this did was sort of replicate some of the limited information we had from histology, from post-mortem analysis of various brains over the course of 50 or 60 years, but they were much fewer in number. This analysis sort of replicated that and validated that to show that, yes, these are real changes that are occurring. But of course, we've got these kids actually developing in front of our eyes, and we can measure a lot of this here that they couldn't do with those post-mortem tests they had. Next. Now, what we can do with a lot of these images is analyze not just that speed at which the brain is developing, but we can actually analyze the amount of development of white matter or gray matter that's occurring in the brain at a very minute scale. So what we call a voxel is a small little box, an electronic box that we would have at a certain part of the brain that we wanted to measure a particular region. So let's say we wanted to look at the visual area, and we wanted to see those circuits that are developing that help us sort of process visual information. We can go to that voxel and just kind of look at that region and see what the density or the amount or the quality of the myelin or the gray matter is, and compare it to other kids with different skills, different abilities, different stages of development, and just kind of measure those and see whether there's a particular trajectory that one set of kids has. And that's basically how we've been kind of mapping out some of these influences, nutritional, exercise. Now we do music, and see whether there's a particular difference in certain areas of the brain in terms of how the quality of their brain develops. Okay. Now, a lot of people ask us, how do we actually get these kids into a scanner? Because getting an adult into a scanner is kind of challenging with, the fear that people have around MRI scanners. They're noisy, they're loud, they kind of feel a little claustrophobic sometimes because they're in that tube. What we do is we scan these kids under sleep conditions for the little ones. The older kids, we scan them while they're watching a movie. What we've done is our program director, who's a magnetic resonance physicist, has worked on certain sequences of the MR magnet. That's that green thing that you see there, sort of a donut-shaped object, and that's where the magnet lies. He's quieting down that magnet by reducing the speed at which the magnet oscillates. And it's the oscillation of the magnet that actually results in these images produced. Slower it goes, the softer it becomes. So it moves from about 120 decibels, where it normally should oscillate at, down to close to about 60 decibels. Partly by slowing down that movement and oscillation, but also partly by soundproofing the bore of the MRI unit that we have. You see those straps here on the magnet. We have some soundproofing that's pushed into the bore. We have the children wear noise-canceling headphones. The babies who are asleep, we have them listen to some white noise that's played a little low. And the children who are awake and watching a movie, they're listening to the soundtrack of the movie. And basically, at that point, it's down to 60 decibels or a little lower, which is at the amplitude of conversation, and so it's not terribly loud, and they don't hear much of the oscillation of the magnet. Because the magnet is slow, typically it would take us a lot longer to acquire these images. But because babies' heads are smaller, it doesn't take us that long. There's the same amount of cuts, we can move through a little quicker, and we can kind of finish up the scans in about the same amount of time for an adult head. It's some simple manipulation, simple physics, but it worked out nicely in our favor to kind of get these babies in and out of there in a reasonable amount of time. To get the basic scans that we're looking for and the basic images that we're looking for analysis, we would take about 25 to 35 minutes to get that done. To add on some of the additional sequences that we do, it takes us about 45 minutes or so to get the rest. Not another 45, a total of 45 minutes. But if we, a child wakes up and we've got the first 25 minutes or 30 minutes worth of scans, sometimes we are okay with that, and we can continue with the study. Getting the children to sleep, we typically work around the family schedule and a child's schedule for naps or sleep, depending on whether they're babies or a little older. The children up to the age of about 2.5, we've been able to do these scans with them asleep. At about 2.5 to 3.5, a lot of them are transitioning out of their naps. They can sometimes stay awake, maybe 3.5, close to 4, watching a movie. And so those we can scan at any point of the day. They can come in and visit the scanner, get a little comfortable with it, and then they hop in. We typically have this sort of set up looking a little less medical. Spaceship that's on there, and the inner space suits, and kind of get into the scanner, and then they watch their movie and they're doing their thing. Parents can go into the scan room because the MR scanner does not have radiation, unlike a CT scan, which is why this allows us to safely get multiple scans on the same individual through the course of the study. The young kids up to the age of about 2.5, we get scans every 6 months because their brains are developing a lot more rapidly than an older child or an adult. And then once they hit that 2.5 year mark, we're getting scans every year. That development is still occurring fairly rapidly, but not as rapidly as across the year. Oh, the other piece around the process by which we get these children to sleep. So a lot of families come in about a half hour to an hour before or around their the anticipated bedtime. We've got some sleep rooms that are set up right near the scanner bay, and the children, we ask parents to bring in certain articles that the children associate with sleep, could be a blanket or stuffed animal, those sorts of things. We get them to sleep in those pack and plays or those cots that we set up, and then we can transport them to the scanner, which is a room away, place them into the scanner, and then under those sleep conditions, we have them to sleep. So we scanned about somewhere around 600 children over the course of the initial study that started up in 2008, 2009. That's that 0 to 5 set of images that I showed you. And onto this study as well. And, we're now working with some pregnant women as well to kind of get some imaging on that. Okay. So who are we studying through this this piece of the ECHO program? And these are kids, like I said, who are exposed to a music program. We're preferably looking for children under 6 years of age. Now that doesn't mean that children older than 6 are ineligible. We just have to consider their eligibility and have a quick discussion about their eligibility. But we're definitely looking for children from birth through 6 years of age. It's a rolling enrollment, so we don't necessarily have to have these children enrolled before they start a music program or attending a program like this, because we can sort of stratify them once the study progresses between the amount of exposure to music they a music program that has some regularity to it, that we enjoy, and then we'll be measuring some of the changes that have occurred at home. They may come here for an hour or a half hour, but we're measuring some of the changes that have occurred at home as a result of the music exposure that they've had, to both music at home, linguistics and language at home, communication, all of those sorts of things, to see whether those doses are amplified a little bit, magnified, and then they have an influence on child development as well. So the areas that we're looking in terms of outcomes of interest, like I said, from a behavior standpoint, we're looking at, as the child grows, their impulsivity, decision-making, planning ability, their ability to inhibit themselves and stop themselves, sort of that decision-making piece, when, they're making choices between two actions. We're looking at social emotional development. All of these are being looked at as individual behaviors rather than looking at them as diagnoses. So we're not looking at, for example, impulsivity in relation to behaviors like that might be seen in children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We're just looking at all these behaviors on a continuum. We're imagining these behaviors to sort of be on a spectrum from, typical behavior for that age, going into behavior that might be considered a little more extreme. If there are any things that we observe in any of the measures that we do that are concerning, that we feel are heading in the direction of pathology, we discuss them with the families and sort of help them connect with their pediatrician to kind of discuss options for assessment of that a little further on the clinical side. Learning, like I said, and I gave you reasons why we were looking at specific areas of learning, but we're looking at phonemic awareness, at literacy readiness in younger kids, nonverbal learning and some of those skills. We're looking at the relationship of nutrition and what happens as nutrients are processed in our system, in the gut, because a lot of those chemicals that we typically have previously believed to be just protein, fat, carbohydrates, now there's a little more information on sort of the quality of the chemicals that are processed through nutrition and how that's beginning to affect brain function and brain development. So we have some colleagues at Wellesley College who are analyzing some of the gut microbiome for us. Because again, the child being exposed to music is one aspect of the environment, but it's not an exposure in isolation. There's diet, nutrition, exercise, there's so many other factors that they're being exposed to, and all of these are kind of working in relationship to each other. And so we want to see what that process is like and who has what influence on brain development as far as these factors are. So the procedures that we're following, we're initially getting some basic information, some static information. For example, birth weight, the gestational age of the child when the child was born, family history, those sorts of things. And then at intervals, as the child comes in for further study, we're getting a variable history to kind of update that. Medical histories change, the diet of the child may change, the sleep pattern of that child may change, so we sort of get updates on that. We're measuring linguistics through vocabulary and developmental measures that we use, but we're also using some of these word and sound recognition devices, which are little cassette-sized things that are placed into a child's clothing that record over about a 24-hour period. They record the sounds that the child is exposed to, the words that the child is exposed to, and that can be analyzed later. And we want to kind of see if there's a big difference between those that are exposed to music at an early age, whether the quality and the type of exposure to music elsewhere, but also other types of sounds and communication is different from those who haven't been exposed to it as much or as early as some of the kids are here, and see whether there are differences then in their brain development. So it's kind of like a dose-related sort of response that we're looking for exposure they get to the changes that are occurring both structurally in the brain and functionally through some of the measures. The neurocognitive learning and behavior measures, like I said, attention, executive function, some of those pre-academic and early learning measures. Phonemics is an area of huge interest for us, which is why I keep popping up on all my slides. But we're trying to look at some of those measures as well, and we have those children go through testing, again, depending on their age. So like phonemics would be done at about 4 years. Next. Looking at nutrition, diet, eating patterns, and those are typically done through questionnaires that families will complete at home, like a 24-hour recall. There's some online questionnaires that they complete. We get the reading out at our end. Some of these measures of behavior and eating-related behaviors, they're paper and pencil questionnaires, but then they send it back to us once they completed them. There's growth that's looked at, because again, a lot of these factors are not, like I said, not working in isolation. We're looking at typical growth parameters like weight and height, and then also looking at something a little more unique in terms of the depth in which we go to look at a child's growth, and that's looking at their free fat mass. And that's a little more sophisticated than us standing on a scale that gives us our body fat index or measurement. The child going in to this little capsule, they're just kind of sitting in there for about 2 minutes. They're typically dressed in swim, like slightly tighter spandex kind of swim shorts, got a swim cap on. This hair can disrupt these movements, clothing can disrupt it, these readings. They're sitting in there, but this is measured through jets of air that kind of blow into this capsule. And once that's done, after about 2 minutes, come out, and you've got a reading of the free fat mass of the child or the individual to the 100th decimal. So it's a little more detailed than our previous measure. Genetics is one area that we're studying, and we're not studying it from a clinical perspective, syndromes and things like that you hear about, medical conditions. We're actually studying the genes that are involved in both the development of the structure of the brain, but also in some of the function of the brain. So there are neurochemicals that are involved in signal transmission and things like that of the brain, and there are certain genes that regulate those. We're studying those. We're studying the genes that are involved in sort of the formation of myelin, that white pattern that we saw. We're looking at all of those to see whether those influences are either mitigated or are enhanced by some of the environmental influences. So that's done through cheek swabs. So we try to be as non-invasive as possible. No blood tests or anything like that involved at this stage. And it's mostly cheek swabs that we do, all the way from babies to the older. So this is a schedule of the study procedures. So like I said, initially when the child would first come in, they get almost everything that we need to get on them as sort of a baseline and a starting point. But once we've collected that, then we start getting the other aspects at regular intervals. And I told you about that, under the age of about 2.5, we're getting about 6-month intervals. Older kids, we get them annually. Neurocognitive assessments, we try, because of the test-retest sort of phenomenon that occurs where if you test them too quickly or too soon, they could remember some of the responses that they gave or the way you asked the question earlier, and that could give you a slightly false reading. We do that annually. The MRIs would depend on the age again. The younger kids, every 6 months. The older kids, we get them once a year. Now, we know that convenience is a big issue, coming in to get those scans and things like that. If there are any missed visits, we can always pick up where you left off. So it's not like, you skipped a visit, you missed it because of an illness or something, and suddenly you're now ineligible. We're pooling a lot of the data based on age and when those children are investigated and examined. And so whenever they can come in, we're happy to assess them and scan them and get, I think that's pretty much it from, that point of view.
A music survey.
Oh, right.
Also it.
Yeah, the other piece that we've not included here, but we're going to work with, this site is looking at, and we'll have a questionnaire that's sort of set up to see how exposure to music here has influenced the way in which a family has introduced music in their lives, or if it has changed communication and sort of the quality of communication and music at home. And we'll kind of use that information. I think it's going to be useful here to the staff, but also will help us kind of analyze some of the word recognition and sound recognition data that we're getting to see whether that's actually translated into more exposure at home as well. So that might be an added question. Is there any questions?
One thing that you didn't speak to tonight that we talked about earlier this morning was about prenatal
Right.
assessment.
Yeah, so we are looking, like I said earlier, part of that ECHO study is looking at pregnant mothers from 22 weeks of gestation onward. While we aren't looking directly at music right now, I think some of the questionnaires that we sort of use, if there's a pregnant mother who's bringing a child over, an older child over, and she's pregnant, there's going to be some exposure to music and things that she gets here. That can translate into music at home as well. We can certainly study that. We are studying those mothers at, I keep forgetting this, 22, 28, and 34 weeks. We're getting 3D ultrasounds to measure the growth of the child, of the baby, the fetus. And then those children, once they're delivered, are rolling right into the protocol that we have for children. And we'll start assessing them at 3 months on in terms of their development. So I think some of those early exposures to music that they might have had in utero, we might be able to see some earlier changes in those babies if they
And just another conversation that happened earlier was about, with the rolling enrollment that you're offering for the study, we can gather the information about how long you've participated in music with your child and at what age you started. So that will be sort of background information that can contribute to the data analysis.
Right.
And you are welcome to participate whether you've had a baseline before or not.
Exactly. So the starting point is variable in terms of the study and the music, but the end point is also variable. So if you've been, attending programs here for 6 months, but you continue with the study for a year or 2 years or 3 years, that dose of exposure that the child has had to music here, we can use that information. So just because you stopped attending music therapy or any classes here doesn't mean you're unenrolled from the study, and vice versa. So the two of them are not married to each other in terms of program. The dose that you get, we'd like to kind of keep this as realistic as possible, which is why we don't prescribe a particular dose in terms of number of days of the week that the child attends music classes. We just want to look at, compare kids who attended once every 2 weeks for a 6-week period to children who attended once a week for a 6-month period. And a lot of it is also not going to be just what they've attended here on site. It's going to be those Lena devices that sort of measure the reports that parents give back about how that's changed the amount of music that they expose to their children to at home. I think all of that is going to influence that dose of music that the child gets, and we'll be sort of looking at analyzing that in relation to that. So I think the hour or half hour here is an important component, but it's not the only component that we're using in measurement. There's a lot, more than 6 days of exposure that they have on site as well.
I would like to know if there is any advantage to the child or the family in participating.
Good question. So, what we do, aside from the information that we get from the scores, the images, and sharing that with the families, so that the families will get a copy of some of the representative images that we pick up on the MRI. They'll get a little CD that has those images. If there is a need, we usually have a letter with the range of the scores that the child has on some of the developmental measures. It's not the scores themselves, but what range those scores fall under, because this is not a clinical assessment that we're sharing for clinical reasons. So we usually don't share scores unless there are some concerns. And if there are concerns around the child's development and scores that we get that are concerning, we'll have a conversation with the family about some options in terms of how that should be worked up or how that should be discussed with the pediatrician in school. In addition to that, for every visit that the child and the family make, they are compensated for their time and effort. There are gift cards that we have for each of the grouped components, so like the MRI, there'll be some compensation for some of the checklists that they provide back. There's going to be compensation for that. Some of the biospecimens that they provide, there's compensation for that. So it's sort of stratified and tiered based on what components they completed, and they get compensation. So typically through gift cards, and that's the target right now, the gift cards that we're using, but that sometimes changes. But it's typically something fairly common that people can have.
I have another concern. So sometimes it happens that something that is deemed safe at one point in time, decades later, is reevaluated as possibly having been harmful to subjects.
Right.
So we're subjecting very developing brains to a lot of technology, and it's expensive technology. How can a parent be certain that there is no harm and that 10 years, 20 years from now, they're not going to look back and deeply regret having subjected their child to this?
Sure. I think, all of these sort of processes, they kind of have some risk involved. I think a lot of the sort of frequency with which we set, the sequence that we set, and the MRI is obviously one of the major components there, is based on data that's pooled across multiple sites for many, many years, and looking at outcomes from them. Now, MRIs are relatively new compared to, say, CT scans or X-rays and those sorts of imaging techniques. The advantage that that's had both in the medical community and in the research community is one of the primary safety issues and positives that's come out of it in sort of comparison has been that there's been absolutely no radiation. And that's one of the key elements with any imaging technique that we use. What this uses is a method with the magnet of the water molecules within our body. That's sort of, it's realigning them as the magnet oscillates. Now, typically, we are exposed to magnetic fields no matter where we go, in different doses. This is obviously a little stronger because it's concentrated in one area, but our water molecules in our body are constantly oscillating back and forth, and this is helping kind of align them so we can get an image out of it. From all the research that we've looked at in sort of designing what kind of a dose a sequence should have, or the strength that we should apply to the magnet, it's all been within regulations based on the research that we have so far. Can we guarantee that there's going to be no data that comes out 15 years from now that says, well, the dose could have been a little different? Sure. We can't guarantee that. There's always going to be that possibility that we get more data. But studies like this that are more comprehensive, that we're looking at data from other regions of the country, different populations, on how they're responding both to the procedures and to the outcomes from these studies, will help us know whether there are things we should modify both in terms of the process, but also in terms of the influences that things have on the outcome. So we can't guarantee that there's absolutely no issue with these, but we're doing them with as regulated and within those regulated parameters as we safely can for these kids. And then we're using techniques that clearly don't have the risks that are involved with some of the other techniques that you might be able to use to examine the same structure. In fact, today, just earlier while I was doing some of my work, there was a new article that came out on an increase in the incidence of childhood and then later, I think later into adulthood, cancers on individuals who had been exposed to CT scans during childhood. And it could have been, and it's sort of a dose-related thing. Now, that was something that we already knew, that CT scans had radiation. How much depends on how many times they've gone through those CT scans, and then what regions they've had to have scanned. That determines where that exposure is. But those are the kinds of things that the medical community tries to minimize. And in minimizing that, they've actually moved to more advanced technology, which has been able to image those same areas of the body, probably with better resolution than a CT scan, using magnetic resonance imaging, because that's a more, not a direct mechanical change, not a direct change that's happening to the body. It's just a resolution that they're looking at differences in terms of how those water molecules are concentrated in our body, and it's picking up on that. And it's using something that is already naturally around us, which are magnetic fields. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense that we kind of try to keep it as clean as possible, obviously as non-invasive as possible, and using the safest technology possible.
A very practical question. I imagine that on the way from Boston to Pawtucket, yeah, that baby is going to fall asleep in the car.
Right.
How? I mean, you must not have a great. You said something like 600 that you. Mm-hmm. And how many have you failed to get to sleep?
Most of the failures that we've had have been those kids who have been around that age when we've thought and parents have thought they've been able to, the kid might be able to either go to sleep in an unfamiliar setting, or are old enough to be scanned awake and watching a movie, but they're not quite ready for that yet. So I'm talking about the 3 to 4 range. As far as babies are concerned, we've not had a whole lot of, we do have failures where, there'll be a baby who just won't fall asleep. But for the most part, we've been pretty successful with getting them to sleep. So, but it's taken a while. So sometimes there have been babies who have been at the sleep rooms for about 2 hours, 3 hours, getting them to sleep. And then some have come in just at the right time. They've had a feed, put them down, and they're out.
Or they fall asleep in the car.
Or they fall asleep in the car, and we immediately move them to the scanner, get that component done right away, and then, keep our fingers crossed that they're going to get through the 25 to 40 minutes, and then pull them out, and that's it. So we've got over 3,000 scans on those 600, because some of them have had multiple images and things like that. Yeah. So the team, sometimes most of their work starts around 6 or 7 o'clock at night, and then has gone on to 10, 11, 12, 1, depending on how many kids they've had and, you know, how difficult it's been to get them to sort of follow through. But worth it.
This strikes me, participating in this strikes me as the sort of thing that's like it's like being a good citizen or something. There's something noble about it. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what kinds of applications you might optimistically see, or what you've learned from previous. I enjoy reading about language development, and I understand that there is the potential for brain damage in utero in an environment where a mother is traumatized, and then the brains and the cells don't go where they're supposed to go, and you know, and that just fascinates me that we're learning those kinds of things. Could you just give a few examples of the kinds of things that have been discovered to this kind of thing?
Yeah, so one common one that I can give you is on lead, the effect of lead. Parts of Rhode Island, and this is based on Rhode Island data that we have. There are parts of Rhode Island that so the water is fine, but the soil has lead in it, and and some regions have a little more lead than you would expect, because historically, when planes would land at the airport in Providence, they would have to dump fuel before they landed. And this was the days before unleaded fuel was used in jet engines. And that lead-laden fuel was going into the soil. So there are certain regions of Rhode Island where we still sometimes see slightly higher levels of lead than we would expect. Now, it's not as high as, you know, the unfortunate incident at Flint, Michigan, and those sorts of levels that we've seen more recently. Levels are coming down, the exposures are coming down. But what we noticed also was both when you geocode those individuals and those kids and those families and plot it against the data that we have, what we found that with higher levels of lead, we were noticing that the early learning composites on some of the developmental measures that we were seeing, they were significantly lower than individuals or children who had what we consider normal lead levels or low lead levels. What we also started noticing was the quality of the white matter in terms of development. So the structural, there are not just functional differences, but even structural differences in the brain of those children, both from a brain volume perspective, not as dramatic, but when you break it down to the individual components, the gray matter versus the white matter, we were seeing some white matter differences. And we're getting close to reporting those. We have about 290 children on whom we're reporting these, and we're in the process of sort of analyzing some of that information. So that would be something from an environmental perspective that we're already seeing differences. We're beginning to actually even compare that to children who are in developing countries. We've got a study through the Gates Foundation that is looking at children in India and Bangladesh and parts of Africa, and we're beginning to compare some of the data that we get here to similarly aged children, trying to get as much of the similar kind of information on them and compare. The other piece, when I said the geocoding, is also distance of their residence from a highway, and we began to notice certain differences there as well. Not as dramatic as the lead levels, but there's something in those, in that distance, and whether it's air quality, whether it's noise pollution, we don't know exactly what that is. But studies like this, we're trying to drill down a little further. And what we have are air quality monitors that we give families to place into, the room where the child is predominantly in the house, and that sort of logs information that we get at the lab, and we can kind of track it to see if there are certain spikes at certain times of the day. Maybe there's a seasonal spike. You know, summer the windows are open for a little longer than in winter, and we're trying to see if there's a correlation there. So that would be a place where we sort of see significant differences in terms of child development.
And for our perspective, for the music component here, we've
Right.
talked about how there's a lot of anecdotal stories that we can tell and point to experiences of children's development and how the music program has affected their behaviors, certainly that we can observe. And we get parent reports about what's happening at home in the rest of their day and their life, but we don't have a lot of good, hard scientific data to tie that to. And to say, well, this is something that's in the environment. And what's great about this study is that it includes all the other factors of environmental influence as well, but you have the ability to drill down and say, well, this child has had a year and a half of music at this time in their life's development. This child has not had that experience, and what are the differences? So it allows us to gain a great deal of detailed information that truthfully our entire field doesn't have.
Right.
There's some more neuroscience research in music, but not looking at this level of development.
And I think our sort of, I don't want to say pie in the sky, but it's certainly a goal that we have to even share this data and this information, especially some of the positive influences that programs like this might have with, for example, with policymakers, to, you know, provide some validation for programs like this, validation for therapy like this, that then makes it, you know, hopefully pushes them in the direction of seeing this as medically useful, not just socially, you know, being a positive influence, but medically useful as well, and having, for example, insurance companies reimburse for services like this when it's used in a therapeutic environment and setting. I don't think it's an unreasonable goal to have. I think it's not been done because there's no data yet. But if this data can show some of that, you know, positive change, that influence structurally and functionally, we can, you know, make as strong a case as possible for that.
Are you looking at reading and language acquisition at the same time?
So all the literacy measures that we had, well, we didn't list out the literacy measures, but we are looking at, like I said, phonemics. So even before a child starts reading, even just the basic of letter sound recognition and acquisition. So we already have data on a lot of the kids, you know, in our initial cohort on through some of these tests that actually neuropsychologists and clinicians and schools use already. So a lot of the language that we use from this study, a lot of the tests and scores, people are going to recognize and they're going to know. So it's not just something that's, you know, done in a research-only environment and something unique to research. We're using tools that are applicable in other settings and understandable from that point of view. The data is you know, comprehensive.
And again, as it's an environmental influence, there's no protocol of what needs to be given from a music perspective for children to be able to participate. So just for folks who are watching this maybe later online, children that participate in an early intervention program with our music therapist or have individual music therapy at home, that information can also be gathered. Children can be included in the study as well.
Yeah. And it's very inclusive. This study, because the NIH is looking at any and all influences on child development, they're not limiting the child who enrolls to just typically developing children or typical patterns of development. They want to look at this broadly and look at as many kids as we can target around the country.
It's going to be hard, isn't it, to get children who are being raised in an environment deprived of sensory inputs.
Right.
Yeah, this would be really a real challenge.
Right, and that's where, you know, for so the children who we might get through this program here, we would be able to compare the exposure and the quality of exposure that they have had across not just music and language and other areas, but even nutrition and whatnot, to the children we might already have or we might continue to collect who don't get a lot of these or don't have the resources for a lot of these programs. And generally, when you're looking at children who don't have as much by way of resources, they're also generally not just lacking in the fact that they didn't go to an exercise program or to a music program. They also might have deficiencies in nutrition. They might have deficiencies in other areas compared to children in these programs. And so we sort of look at that. Now, there could be some who don't have that, and they just didn't get exposed to music because that was something that the family didn't have knowledge about. Maybe it wasn't close enough. Maybe schedules didn't allow for it, and they didn't get into something as robust as this. But other things are all equal, and so music might be the only difference. In which case, we sort of look and see whether those kids are uniquely developing one way or the other.
And I'm saying that I would think it would be more of a challenge
Sure.
to get those children, to 5 children enrolled in as participants.
Sure, for various reasons. But on the other hand, I think with the population, we've been pretty broad in terms of targeting groups and going to various sites. So I think we have a pretty good mix. And the good part is we're 2 years into the study with the NIH, and we've had to share data with the NIH. And what we found was our socioeconomic distribution, our racial distribution, gender distribution is comparable to the other cohorts around the country. So that was reassuring for us that we weren't sort of skewed in one direction or another, and we might have to interpret our data a little differently and control for that. It actually matched pretty well with sites across the country, Native American population, all the way from California right up here to the northeast.
Are you the only site doing the MRI functional structural brain imaging, or there are multiple sites
There are
all
some
doing
other
the same?
Not as many as the other measures, but because neurodevelopment is just one outcome that the NIH is looking at. And even within that, we might be one of, I think, 6 sites or 6 cohorts. There may be more sites, like 19 out of the 82 sites that are doing it. There are more sites that are doing some of the neurocognitive measures, but they're also not doing as many as we are in terms of domains. So remember that second slide that has that list of domains up? They're looking at fewer aspects. So some of them may look at, when a child they're looking more at screening kinds of measures, looking at when a child is using their first words, sentences, walking up and down stairs. They're using those as proxies for development, as opposed to using standardized measures that we would use in a clinical setting. Like we use standard scores and have a little more in-depth interpretation to that.
There was one other question that came through here that was about looking at the differences between participatory live or passive listening to music, which makes me think it's something we should be capturing in one way or another as we put some questions out there.
Yeah, I think we can certainly do that through the question. We would hope that we can capture some of that through the LENA devices, the recognition devices found in word recognition devices. Those would be, we expect families to sort of turn those on representative days, like an average weekend day and maybe one of the weekdays, or something like that to get a 24-hour recording. But we can modify this. It's not like this is a protocol that we're bound to, and certainly these smaller aspects. If we find that the LENA pieces and information that we're getting, we need to tweak the protocol a little bit, we have some flexibility to do that, to capture as much as we can. We obviously can't capture a 7-day stretch just yet, but we can try as much as we can. And the other bit is that even with the preliminary data that we start getting, if it is significant enough and is raising enough of questions, we would pull some of these aspects out and apply for additional funding to study those aspects separately. And then we can really customize that protocol to whatever way we want and make it as detailed as possible. We've already started talking about that for kids who have been exposed to multiple episodes of anesthesia. The children who have come out, born with congenital issues that require surgery, heart defects and things like that. They've had multiple surgeries or long, drawn-out surgical procedures, cardiac bypass, those sorts of things. We're interested in sort of studying those, and we're trying to put in applications for additional funding. And that was just based on some very preliminary data that we got.
And it points to that do-good citizen role of,
Right.
of gathering data helps inform future decisions that have an impact on everyone.
Yeah.
And the good part is all the 32 cohorts are very collaborative. Again, sitting today, I got an email from, it was sent to all 80 sites and all the principal investigators, because there's one investigator who wants to submit and pool her data with anybody else who's interested and submit to a particular scientific group at a conference. And so she's just looking for others within the ECHO group and said, let's pool our data and see if we have a better paper to present. So this is helping, and I think we can, by doing this, we can get more robust, publishable results a little quicker than one site taking it all on. Because now we're working and sharing this information. By the way, all the information that gets shared with the NIH is all de-identified, meaning that the name is removed. If dates of birth are included, it's because the age is not available, but we typically have the age available. If there's geocoding information that's included, it's typically the zip code to know where, a particular zip code, what area that kind of covers, inland versus close to the shore, those kinds of things. So there is a little bit that's semi-identifiable, but it's not easy to identify someone with the data that we share. So.
I think the questions that have come through to me here from our listeners have been answered, so.
Oh, okay.
I'm just imagining how interesting it would be 25 years from now for these kids to be adults walking around and know that they are participants in this study that's really pretty special.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if this goes the way the Framingham study has gone, we would like them to be in touch with the various groups that are studying things or that, continue to study this, because I think the medical and scientific community wants to sort of create that continuum of the same individual, as many as possible, studying them through their lifespan, looking at various influences at various stages.
Well, we are very excited about the partnership and the opportunity to work together. So thank you so much for taking the time to inform our families about the opportunity and continue to talk about it here. And the next steps for families would be to contact the lab through the website or the email address to have that information, and to have a conversation and set up a visit. Would be the first thing. And as time goes on, if there's things that can be done here locally or things that can be mailed or emailed sent via computer, we'll try to make the impact as minimal as possible on having to travel or inconvenience.
Right. At this point, we're looking at most of the information, the checklists and behavioral sort of measures and things like that. Those can be done remotely. It's just a few of those components that are essential to be face-to-face. But we try to space those out as much as possible.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks so much.
that's really interesting. Thank you.